Okay, but I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wangal people and the different nations that we meet across today in Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. I also reflect on the importance of Indigenous knowledge and capability in natural hazards research. Today is actually a nice small project management committee meeting of 6 to 7 people, but we've actually got 43 and another 10 coming. So we've actually got up to 60 people coming today, which is a little bit bigger than our usual 10 project management committee. And I think that's a true reflection of the amazing work that Dave Bowman and his crew have been doing as part of their Natural Hazard Research Australia project. I'd like to thank you all for coming along. Today is about the bushfire risk at the rural-urban interface, with a bit more discussion about the LA fires, as it's been very topical for everybody. And there'll be some questions and answers at the end, but if you could put your questions into the chat, that would be fabulous. And then you can use your little emotions, such as thumbs up or smiley faces, to vote for those questions so we can focus on those towards the end. We want to get straight into it. So I'd like to introduce our speakers, David Bowman, Grant Williamson, Amila and Owen Price, who are all going to talk to you today about bushfire risk mitigation and the rural-urban interface. And we're focusing on embers, house loss and hazard mapping. So over to you, Dave Bowman, to introduce your project and your crew.
Hi, thanks for coming along. And I know we're still in the middle of a fire season, so it's really impressive that you guys have been able to find time to think through a really important topic, which I sort of start at the end first, which is we've seen something quite horrifying, I suppose, in LA, which is, you know, the fire burning into suburban environments. And that raises huge questions globally and obviously here in Australia. We've been thinking about the whole question of how do you actually, if you boil it down to the bare essentials, how do you actually assess the risk on the wildland-urban interface? And now we see in sharp relief the worst case possibility, which is that a fire just keeps going into a city or the edge of a city. But how do you assess that? How do you think about that? Now, what scientists do is that they take big ideas and big problems, they break them down into parts. And the problem is that because we get very good at working with our parts, the whole often gets lost. So what we're going to do today is we're going to break this big problem down into these parts, which I like to think of as pieces of a pie. We're going to talk about those individual pieces, and then we're going to build the thing back up together again to address the question, the question that's on everybody's mind. Is an LA style event actually truly a possibility? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the modules of our project, and those modules have, you know, they're mature research questions, and we're going to look at them and we're going to hear the key finding first. Then we're going to talk about the method, the really messy, complex science, and we're going to work through, and then at the end of this presentation, we're going to join it back together again and think about the caveats, the things that aren't so certain, the things that we might want to continue doing, the things we might have glossed over, and most importantly, your thoughts and reflections, because that's actually an incredibly important wellspring of inspiration for further research. So I'm going to hand over to Amil, and I'd like all of the presenters, because this is a multi-presentation, to very briefly introduce themselves so we get a seamless transition. So I'll hand over to Amil. He's going to talk about embers, and then we're going to move through the other presenters and see where we get to.
Thank you, David. I'm Amil. I'm a postdoc at UTAS. I'm mainly working related to physics-based modeling of embers. As we know, ember attack is one of the primary causes of house destroying and damaging during bushfire events. So understanding the ember dynamics is really important to prepare strategic plans to mitigate this risk. So in our work, we used physics-based modeling to simulate the ember storms and try to understand the ember landing patterns and the quantities. So from our work, we found that mostly like over 95% of embers landed within the 100 meters to the fire front, which means not many embers passed like more than 500 meters. A lot of embers landed very close to the fire line. And also we could see there's a relationship with the elevation or topography and the ember landing distance. For example, the embers generated at hilly areas travel further compared to the embers generated in a valleys or a flat land. And also, as you can see in the right-hand side figure, we could see there's a increase of ember landing distance with the fire danger index. When the severity of fire is very high, we could see more embers landing in a further distance. So actually, what is a physics-based model and what we did here? So physics-based model is actually, it uses some principles of fluid dynamics, mass transfer, heat transfer to identify the ember trajectories and their behavior under different fire weather, vegetation, or topographical conditions. So what we did here was, we took the LiDAR data of the area of interest and tried to create a three-dimensional representation of that geographical location. For example, in this creation, we included the structure of vegetation, the fuel density, the canopy structure, and how the porosity varies throughout this vegetation structure, sort of things. And also we could include the variation of topography and the building layouts. Next, what we did was we used some images of actual ember collections and try to derive their morphologies, for example, size, shapes, and composition. We could include this information as inputs to our physics-based models. And also we simulated the wind climate or wind speeds at that time of fire. For example, these wind speeds represents the fire danger indices at that severity of fires. And we could include the eddies and also the turbulence to make it more realistic. Next, we let the embers to generate at the points where fire started within the canopy region. Then we could actually track the embers trajectories in space and time to find their landing locations. So we conducted two different studies. One is a case study. This is actually, we try to reproduce the firebrand attack or ember attack in the Conchula Park, which was severely affected by 2020 Corona fire. And the main objective was to find what would cause the house loss patterns of this area. So we assumed it is because of the embers, and we simulated 8 different kind of cases varying the fire danger index and also the wind speed, wind direction, and the fire line location. So as you can see here, we can see the actual house loss patterns in these red dots, which are the destroyed houses, and the yellow color shows the damaged houses, and green are not undamaged houses. And when we simulated these cases, we could see when the fire line is very close to the community and the fire danger index it's in like extreme level during that fire attack into this region, there's a similarity of house loss pattern and the ember landing pattern. But again, we could see a lot of embers land very close to the fire line and not going more far. So as you can see in this right-hand side panels, this is for the fire danger index 50, which is the average fire danger index at the time fire attack in the Conchula area. And the next one is the fire danger index 91, which is the extreme case. We could see when the fire danger increase, more embers land further, but still the majority land within 100 and 200 meter this range. So from this work, we could basically identify the ember landing distance for each scenario and the landing density on houses and the surrounding buffer zone, as well as we could identify the effect of wind and terrain and their influence for ember landing distance. Again, we did another set of work, we conducted nearly 36 simulations to identify the ember landing distance and influential factor for varying this distance. Here we vary the wind speeds, temperature, fuel load, and we simulated the ember landing patterns in two different kind of topographical areas. One is a flat land, other one is a hilly landscape. So both these landscapes were reconstructed following the actual areas that were severely affected by 2019-20 Black Summer fire. And the other one is the Taronga area in Tasmania, which was affected by 1967 Black Tuesday. So running many simulations, we could get a lot of information to develop a statistical model, finally leading to hazard mapping. And Grant will explain in detail what we did in hazard mapping. So this is how we simulated the ember storms using physics-based models.
And now over to me. I'm Owen Price from University of Tasmania and also University of Wollongong. And I've spent my recent career essentially looking at empirical or statistical evidence of what's happening in fire, whether that be what we're about to talk about now, house loss or effectiveness of prescribed burning, but really focusing on what the past patterns of fires tell you and what we can learn from them. Amil has already mentioned that he finds this magical number of 100 meters, which describes where 95% of the embers are lost. So that is, if you like, that's what ought to happen with fire. But you can test what actually happens with fire using the data from the 2019-20 bushfire, Black Summer fires, and testing that against the bushfire-prone land mapping, which is what I'm going to show here for New South Wales. And essentially what we found is that the 100-meter rule that is applied in New South Wales works extremely well. So if you take the left-hand graph that you can see here, what we've got plotted here is as you go away from bushfire-prone land, that's the distance, the x-axis, and then you look at the percentage of the losses that have occurred at that distance, and look at the two red lines, which is one is all houses destroyed, that was about 2,000 houses, or all destroyed buildings, which is about 8,000, I believe. What you find is, first of all, 80% of the losses occurred in situations which were actually inside bushfire-prone land. And then as you move away slightly on the x-axis, those red lines increase, and it shows that about 95% of the losses were within 100 meters of the bushfire-prone land. So it's working extremely well. In other words, only 5% of losses are going to occur outside that 100 meters. But there is a bit of a complication, and that is that it's not the same in all kinds of weather. So we were able to attribute the time that the losses probably occurred with what the weather was like, and then this right-hand graph then shows you a breakdown by, it's essentially the same graph, but broken down into houses experiencing different levels of FFDI. Now, I should point out that this is not counting the houses that were lost within the bushfire-prone land, only the ones outside it. This is to make the graph more obvious to see what the patterns are. And what it shows is that, broadly speaking, when the weather is relatively mild, up to about 50, 75% of houses, house loss outside of bushfire-prone land occur within that first 100 meters. But it starts to break down when the weather gets worse than that. So, for example, by the time you're at FFDI at greater than 100, only 40% are within that 100 meters. So that is to say that there's a fair level of house loss beyond 100 meters when you're at FFDI above 100. So now that's what we actually found, but I have to explain how we got to that. So essentially, the data we're using here is explained in this map that shows in green the bushfire-prone land maps that the Rural Fire Service use, and that's available from the New South Wales Seed Portal. Then we have in red is where the fires were in 2019-20, and then I just shown the houses that were lost in those fires. We also have progression from fire progression data for those fires, so we know more or less where the fires were at different times, and could get nearby weather station data to work out what the weather was like at the time that the houses were impacted. And the other thing we've got is the Microsoft building footprints. So that's a data set that shows where every single building centered in the world is, and we use that to extract the 85,000 houses that were actually exposed to these fires. And the methods, there's a fairly straightforward GIS step process where you turn your bushfire prone land into a distance on a raster or a grid, calculate that distance for every house, find out the weather from the progression data, and then plot those patterns. And I just wanted to say a little bit more nuance, because the graphs don't tell the whole story. Just to have a look at some cases here. So this is Cabargo in 2019. What this is showing is, there we have in brown is bushfire prone land category 3, which is essentially grassland, which surrounded most of that town. And then the red lines are the actual 100-meter buffer, although for grass it's actually a 30-meter buffer that was applied. And what you can see here is, although some of the houses were actually outside the buffer that got lost, and some of them were inside bushfire prone land, the great majority of the houses actually got saved in Cabargo. And then here's an example from Conjola that Amol had already focused on. And this is a little bit more complicated, I would say. Most of the houses that got lost here were within the 100-meter buffer, but you can see there is a few that are outside. So in other words, more in the center of the town. And trying to understand the pattern of loss here would be pretty complicated. And then the third example I thought I'd show you is this one, Maxville, northern New South Wales. There were a lot of houses lost here, but they were all very spread out and intermingled within forest and in buffer areas. And I mentioned the Microsoft building footprints. What that enables us to do, so we know how many houses were lost inside bushfire prone land, but we can also work out how many houses there actually were inside those areas exposed to the fires. And when you combine those two numbers together, what you find is this graph. It shows that of the houses that were actually in bushfire prone land and exposed to the fires, more than half of them were destroyed. As you go further out from the bushfire prone land, so up to 50 meters, less than around 5% were destroyed. 100 meters is less. And then once you build up beyond 100, very, very, very low probability of losing a house. Now, what the thing is that this method that we're showing about assessing bushfire prone land, it does show that 100 meters is a very useful rule of thumb. But of course, what it doesn't tell you is those 50% of houses that were lost within bushfire prone land doesn't tell you which ones were lost. Doesn't help you to predict that. And that's something I'll come back to later.
Thanks, Owen and Amil. I'll take over now and share my screen. I'm Grant Williamson from the University of Tasmania. I've worked with David and Owen for a long time, looking at a wide variety of issues around fire behaviour and pyrogeography. And what I'm going to be talking about here is some comparisons we've done of that bushfire prone land plus the 100-meter buffer classification with a few more process-based or physical models of what's actually driving house loss and how well they agree. So what I'm showing here in these two maps, which I will come back to at the end of my section, are some zoomed in areas around the wildland urban interface of the western shore of Hobart. The dark boundary with the hash inside, the dark black line, shows that bushfire impact zone, or that bushfire prone land classification plus 100 meters. The orange areas show the outputs of our ember impact model, which I'm going to go through. And then the red and the blue show individual buildings and whether they were inside the threshold of our radiant heat damage index in red, or outside the threshold of that radiant heat calculation in blue. So overlaying all three here, we can see broadly there's pretty good agreement between that black 100-metre buffer once again and these alternative, more physical measures of the impact or the potential for house loss. We can see some areas where they don't agree. We can see some areas, for example, where there's large areas of those red dots where there's projected radiant heat damage which are outside the impact zone. We can also see some areas of the orange ember spread outside that impact zone as well, outside the 100-metre buffer. And I'll talk a bit about why we may see some of those special cases. But broadly, the 100-metre buffer does tend to get most of the houses. There's fairly good agreement there. So how did we do this? First of all, we used the output of the ember simulation modelling that Amil has discussed. And what I wanted to do is try and encapsulate that into a fairly simple statistical model. So as Amil described, he ran many simulations under a variety of fire weather conditions, under different wind speeds, under different temperatures, under different fuel loads. And for each of those simulations, we worked out what was the distance that 95% of the embers made it to. We can say that 5% of the embers went even further, but we needed some sort of reasonable cutoff, some sort of heuristic to say, this is the distance that most of the embers fell in, the vast majority. Using the output of all those simulations, I developed a statistical model to predict that maximum ember transport distance based on fuel load and fire weather. Now, I first of all tried to decompose the fire weather and say, well, do we need to look at wind speed and temperature separately as drivers of this behaviour of ember distance? And I found that in statistical terms, using this modelling, it actually didn't make much difference. FFDI alone was a good enough predictor of ember distance, independent of wind speed and temperature as separate variables. I think if we had more data and more simulations and more variants of the weather conditions we were using to drive the model, we might be able to tease apart some of those specific differences. But for our purposes, we can do it quite simply, and we can just say, as we see on this graph here, that the ember transport distance varies with forest fire danger index. With higher FFDI, you get further distances, and also with the fuel load in the forests. With higher fuel load, we get more embers being generated and a greater transport distance as well. What did we do with this? Now that we've got this very simple statistical empirical relationship whereby with a given fire danger index and a given fuel load, we have a distance that embers travel, we can project this into GIS, using a GIS into geographic space. We did this by taking the vegetation polygons on the wildland urban interface, and for each of those, projecting that ember distance, in this case specifically in a southeastern direction, because we're assuming for Hobart a northwest wind is going to be the main sort of weather conditions driving extreme fire behaviour. We projected those embers in a southeast direction away from the vegetation type, and the distance was based on the fuel load in that vegetation type. We assumed steady state equilibrium fuel loads for the vegetation types around Hobart, rather than, we haven't incorporated past wildfires or prescribed burning into this. We just want to know the maximum distance, assuming maximum fuel load. Projected them in that direction based on that fuel load and based on a set FFDI of 80 we used in these simulations. That produced the orange boundary we saw in those maps earlier, which I'll go back to at the end of the presentation. The other thing we did was modelling radiant heat impact on buildings, and this is based on the scenarios in the equations behind the BOW ratings. We tried to find what's a safe distance beyond the fire line for a given fuel load, vegetation type, weather, topography, beyond which a house shouldn't have impact from radiant heat based on the BOW ratings. And then we compared that to the actual distance of the building from vegetation. So if a building was closer to the vegetation than it should be, then it gets a high index value, in this case shown here in red, projected in geographic space. If the building is far enough away from vegetation that it wouldn't have an impact from radiant heat, then it's shown in blue. And you can see variations in that index. What this is really showing us across this map of the Hobart area once again is the urban area in blue, where buildings are a long way from the vegetation, and the dense vegetated areas in red, where you're sitting right in the vegetation, and if there were a fire, you would obviously have direct radiant heat impacts. And the WUI boundary, which is sort of those white to pink colours, where the distance of the house from the boundary actually matters quite a lot as to whether it would be impacted or not. Going back to these maps, the bushfire impact zone here, once again, shown in black, does provide a reasonable estimate. It concurs mostly with our ember map in orange and our radiant heat map in red and blue. It does identify areas of local concern though, where that bushfire impact zone, the 100-metre buffer, maybe isn't perfect. We feel that's driven by topography. Our modelling of radiant heat in particular does take into account the topographic position of the house. Is there downhill fire spread or uphill fire spread towards the property? Is there a long fire run distance which can influence fire behaviour as well in the run up to the property? It also has a more detailed accounting of vegetation type. We know from looking at radiant heat and from embers that the very high fuel load we get in some of the wet forest communities around Hobart can produce greater radiant heat, obviously, and also greater quantities of embers being produced and travelling on average a longer distance, which the fixed 100-metre buffer doesn't necessarily take into account. So broadly, though, the buffer does work. 100 metres does seem to capture most of the houses that are at risk, but identifying these local areas beyond that would be useful. And I think this goes into what Owen was saying as well about some of the impacts beyond the 100-metre boundary that we see, driven by more extreme fire weather conditions, driven by local vegetation and so forth. Thank you. I will hand on now.
That's me. And I'm going to wrap up with a sort of an idea of where we go next. So as Grant and Amila have both shown, and my analysis on bushfire prone land has shown, that 100 metres is a proven guideline for planning purposes. But it does not explain, it's got a few drawbacks. The first of which is it doesn't explain which houses are destroyed. So if we look again at that Conjola example that we've looked at before, while it explains a lot of the house loss patterns there, it doesn't explain some of those ones that are further away than 100 metres, what exactly happened. And it doesn't explain which of those houses inside the bushfire prone land are going to get destroyed and which aren't. But probably even more importantly, it doesn't explain what happened in LA. So here's a photograph of the Eaton fire just a month ago, and you can see that the 100-metre rule does not apply in this kind of fire. This is a step change kind of fire compared to what we found in our studies. And then that last graph shows, while Amila's work suggests that most of the ember storms are falling within 100 metres of the bushland, this is an extraordinary amount of embers, and this is more than 100 metres away from the bushland. So you have to ask yourself, how does this fire propagate through these urban situations, and where do these embers come from? We need to understand the whole process of fire spread. It's not just about distance to the bush. What we actually need is a specific model of fire spread within the WUI, and there's a variety of ways that this can be done, and I'm pursuing this particular empirical method. Here we are on the left-hand side. This is the actual pattern of fire spread. And what we want to try and understand is why did the fire pick certain houses and not others? And in other words, how did the fire spread, taking out some houses and not taking out others? To do this, I've conceptualized this in probably the same way that everybody else does. We're looking at an individual house, that's the thing in the middle, and it's surrounded by all these different risk factors and methods of attack. So it could be flames, radiant heat, or embers, and they're going to come either from the garden, the next door house, or in my diagram here, I've got these trees, the forest beyond it. So we call that the distant fire risk. And so that's the conceptual model, and the formal model looks something like this. So here we have nodes that describe the level of risk And eventually they all combine and point down towards the question, will that house get destroyed? And you populate this model with values from actual fires, actual houses, and actual gardens, and actual forests, or to look at the historical pattern of what did happen. And so I'll just go through these nodes in a little bit. So first of all, the one on the right is called the distant fire risk. So that's in a way of describing that not all fires are the same. They're actually, some of them have got far more power in them, and so in a given situation, distance to housing, they're going to have more impact. The second one highlighted in red there is the neighbor risk. So there's something about the properties of the houses near you that can influence your risk, and that's something to do with what they're built from, and also whether or not they got set alight. And then the next one over is the garden risk. So there's something about the attributes of the garden that are immediately around you that are going to contribute to whether or not you're going to burn. And that, again, that's something to do with like the amount of shrubbery or trees and the distance, and whether or not that garden actually burned, they contribute. And so you combine all of those things together with some attributes of the focus house, like what it's built out of, and you can end up with a probability of your house being destroyed. Now, it's a bit early days, but I would just say that I'll just show you this one graph that's showing that the initial models are being quite informative. When we use 2019-20 house loss patterns in New South Wales, so the same data as we're using for that bushfire prone land analysis, this graph is showing you that as you increase the amount of shrubs in the garden, the probability of loss increases. But it increases very rapidly if your garden was actually burnt, and it increases, can be quite protective if the garden wasn't burnt. So this is an illustration of how complicated this can be. This definitely showing a very strong effect of a lot of shrubs is very bad if they catch alight. Now, one of the problems with doing this statistical modeling on the data that we have is that, as I indicated in the first analysis, most of the houses that get lost in Australia have been within 100 meters. So this is a shot of Marysville in 2009, probably the worst house loss statistics we've ever had in terms of the number of houses lost in one community, and also the proportion. 95% of the houses were lost in that town. But the thing is, they're all within 100 meters of the bush. Now, that's a very, very different situation to the Eaton fire that we've just had in LA. What we understand is that something quite different is happening in the Eaton fire. So we're not talking about fire spreading from the bush. It's something about the properties of the houses themselves, and possibly the gardens, but more likely the houses, that are causing this kind of spread. And the problem is, if we develop a model such as I'm doing now with only Australian data, because we never had something like this, it will not be able to predict the Eaton fire. Whereas what we think is that most likely we've only avoided a fire like that because up to now we've got lucky, and or because the worst aspects of climate change are still to be felt. So what we really need to do is to start looking at those fires from overseas and say, well, what can they tell us about the risk we may face either in the near or the more distant future? And luckily, we do have some collaborators in California, so this is something we could get into. And with that, I think I will hand back to David.
We were set a challenge last week, which was basically to explain ourselves and the relevance of what we're doing. And I am going to argue that, just those very brief presentations, we've taken what could be, very dense, fragmented scientific studies, and we've joined them together. Say, you're dealing with a lab group, a research group that actually can start seeing this really existential problem holistically. Now, a lot of people talk about holistic thinking and how you join it all together. What I'm arguing is we've shown you how to do that. We've done it. We're doing it. We have a deep and complex and coherent understanding of a very serious problem. What we have also done is that we can envisage, have prototypes, tools that could help managers and help people who are tasked with assessing risk, improve the assessment of risk. But what Owen has said is, unless this is a hungry monster for data, and we actually have to feed this understanding, or we're going to be like putting on blinkers, not understanding that something like LA, not anticipating, preparing for something like what happened in LA. Now, it may well be when you do the analysis that LA is actually LA's problem and it's not Australia's problem, that there are many fundamental differences between California and Australia. And the largest one, by the way, is that in New South Wales and Victoria, it's got a totally different climate. So even the most basic pyrogeographic shaping, in fact, it can't, just because there are fire-prone environments doesn't mean that they're actually the same. They have a different fire regime, a different fire patterns, fire behaviours, and so on. And obviously, you know, the Santa Ana winds, but we do have downslope winds. So there's this, I think, concern, the appeal that we're making is we actually have a coherent understanding, but we're not claiming we understand the problem totally. We have, it's coherent, but it's not comprehensive. We never said it was comprehensive. And if you want a better understanding, then that leads to the next slide. We have to address the caveats. And the caveats is that this is actually, you're seeing applied pyrogeography in action. You're seeing smart people doing clever things quickly. But respectfully, the investment we have, I like to say we're hobbyists. We're people who are dreaming about making a tank, but we don't have tanks. We're just imagining it. You could fly, but we're not flying. And so there's a real tension that we're hungry to advance knowledge, but obviously there's lots of pragmatics. How do you bring everybody along on the journey? How do you make certain that we're not becoming too fascinated with possibilities and losing sight of actually the main game, which is protecting the community? So there's lots of caveats in what we're doing. You know, would you actually want to base your whole fire management strategy around a bunch of academics and their thoughts and thinking? So there's got to be an interplay. And that's really what we're trying to open up. But the point I'm trying to make, at short notice, we have shown a whole. We think holistically. We are doing this. We're coherent, but we're not comprehensive. So let's take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much to your whole team. It's brilliant. We do have some questions in the chat already. Mika's made a comment that houses in LA are predominantly timber due to the earthquake risk. If there's any feedback on that one. But it does lead into the next question by James Carter, wondering to what extent you consider house-to-house ignition, particularly given construction standards, as Mika mentioned above, also the total evacuation and lack of people available to manage ember attack. Pass this one over to your group to answer.
My answer? We think you're probably right there, but I guess the point is we don't know until we test it. We need to actually have a look at some of the spread patterns in the LA fires and the other fires that they've had over there, and see what role that the construction standards have. I mean, it has to be something to do with house-to-house transmission, has to be with something about very large fuel loads that are in these houses that enable this to happen. But it's also possibly distance between the houses. Quite often they're very close together. They certainly were in the Eden fire, and that raises the possibility that most of the fires we've had in in Australia, houses have been relatively far apart, but we're building suburbs that are as close together as those ones that we've seen alive now.
Thank you. Extending on that, there's also a comment by Chantel that and garden design is very different with gardens often right up against the houses. This is in LA. So it's a comment.
Yeah, another factor worth considering, yeah.
Okay.
And if I can chime in there,
Yeah.
we could have talked about our garden research. That there's a whole set of research we've been doing on garden design, flammability, conceptual models of defensible space, flammability of plants, and right up to the idea of developing a self-assessment app to allow landowners to think about the risk. And we've also done social science, because the difference we have with gardens and houses is that they're the community, right? And people have feelings and attitudes about their property. So, and one of the things I would warn fire managers, if I've learned anything from epidemiology, public health, and the pandemic, is that if you go in hard, you might, in the short term, protect everybody, as we did in the pandemic, but then you can get tremendous community blowback and resentment. Even though they were protected, they're angry about the way they were protected. So that's why some social science is very important to bring this along, to make certain that our cure may be incredibly effective, but it's just everybody hates you. So, and then that will have political consequences. So it's a really lot, there's whole other layers and spheres of thinking that go around that pie that we were looking at. And I wanted to, at short notice, just focus on the main game. But, we're very aware of those other dimensions, attitudes, feelings, sentiment, community, and how we engage with the community, which is paradoxical because the community wants to be safe, but then the community can hate you for making them safe.
Yeah, social science is important, Dave. I know physical scientists, we love talking with the social scientists too. Now, for those who'd like more information about the social science as well as the gardens assessment, have a look on the web link that I put at the start of the chat, and it'll tell you a little bit more about the project and even give you a link to some of the publications that are coming out from Dave and his crew's work at the moment. Now, I'll take us to Jeremy's question, Jeremy Little. Thank you, Jeremy. How is bushfire-prone lands defined and mapped in your study? It is defined differently in different jurisdictions. So in Victoria, bushfire-prone land mapping includes a buffer but excludes small patches of vegetation. Ember density and distance will vary depending on fuel type, e.g. stringy bark, candle bark.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And broadly, bushfire-prone land does have a definition that excludes small patches of vegetation. Finding out exactly how it was defined for various states proved quite difficult. In Tasmania, it seems to be mapping produced separately by each local government area according to some rules which we weren't unable to find. So mapping the vegetation we're considering for embers and making sure it's exactly the same as the vegetation being considered for bushfire-prone lands is ongoing work to try and get those aligned. But certainly the definition is quite simple. Owen pointed out grassland, for example, being treated with a different buffer than forested vegetation. But we are seeing here that the type of forest definitely does seem to matter. And as you say, yes, the ember density based on stringy bark versus candle bark and so forth is another issue which we could build into the sort of ember simulations we're doing, which aren't necessarily taken into account with that very simple bushfire-prone land definition.
Jeremy, feel free to come off mute and talk if you'd like to extend.
Yeah, so just another question when it comes to that, the actual buffer from bushland, if the mapping already has a buffer in it and you're saying 100-metre buffer from the mapped area, does that actually mean that the buffer where your impact is a distance from the mapping rather than the bushland? So just clarifying that, that buffer area.
So for the Tasmanian examples I showed, 2 layers were available from the state data service. One was bushfire-prone land, and one was bushfire impact zone. And that bushfire impact zone is the 100-metre buffer. So we used those layers as provided. We didn't calculate the buffer ourselves.
Yeah, and the same with mine, Jeremy. That the 100-metre rule that I've found was the buffer, is the buffer that they've imposed. And I should say, your issue about the size of the patch that they do it in New South Wales, they exclude small patches, and each individual local government area has got flexibility in exactly how they do that mapping. But I would say that trying to work out how big a patch has to be before it counts as a risk factor is a really important research question, because we really don't know.
Right, thanks, Jeremy. Jess has also asked, are your garden design results available to the public?
So the best thing to say is we can send the papers that we've produced, the manuscripts that are in review, and we do have a prototype garden assessment app that we're discussing with people, and if any person out there who's interested, we're very happy to organise a presentation and explain the logic of what we've done. So yeah, absolutely, we're wanting to share this information. We're not saying it's the solution, but it's the best we could do, noting that every jurisdiction has got slightly different constraints, and the way we designed, Grant might want to talk about this, the way we designed and in fact indeed did a sensitivity analysis of the garden tool, as we call it, a fire app, is that it needs to be flexible, so it can be harmonises with the rules that apply in the particular jurisdiction. So we've sort of got a two-speed system, a generic model, and if somebody was super interested for their jurisdiction, we can customise it to make certain that obviously consistency is important. You don't want to have confusion when you're trying to help people to, proclaim or satisfy themselves that they've got a fire-safe garden. Grant, do you want to add?
Well, I could add to that. I do know, I think we had Stefania here logged on earlier. I don't know if she still is, and this is really her project, which is another part of the overall NHRA project we're working on. But our process was to test various combinations of the garden criteria we tested. For example, is the garden well watered? Do you have vegetation at a certain distance from the houses? Do you have shrub layers? Do you have paths in the garden? Do you have gas bottles, for example? We did a sensitivity analysis seeing how much including or excluding each of those variables had an impact on the safety of the garden overall. And from that, we're able to identify a ranking of the most important factors in gardens. But that's all coming out of Stefania's work and publications, which hopefully we will see soon.
Thanks, Grant. So we might throw to Melissa now. She's got a hand up, patiently waiting. A million questions, I'm sure.
Oh, patiently. Oh, look, and I think it's a testament to this project that you've had this many people sort of turn up. Because
viral
it's very
science,
interesting.
Man.
Well, and I just want to go back to the previous point, is I heard a lot of we could do this, we could do, and there's a lot of this work that is really important. So what is currently in scope for this project in terms of looking at some of those refinements? And I think a number of times I've said to Owen in particular, you've looked at 100 metres and that's great, but what if it was 90? What if it was 80? And the different vegetation as well. And I think we've previously had a discussion about how the bushfire prone land around grasslands as well, and whether that matches exactly the same. But what's the next lot of work that's going to happen in this space, in this project?
I might answer that. So I've had a lot of thinking about applied pyrogeography, applied science, how you do it. And where I've landed is that the scientists have to be innovative and inventive, but they've got to actually have stakeholders who are passionate about what they're doing and going to use what they're doing. So there's a dialogue and interaction. So we're on track to do what we said we would do, and that was through a co-design process that was brokered by natural hazards. So all of the things we're talking about, we could do this, we could do that. Really, it's a further conversation with the stakeholders. Say, yeah, we could do that, but it's going to cost. And if we spend that time doing that, there's going to be consequences. We won't be doing this other thing. So the prioritisation step and the refinement step and the delivery step are something we've all got to participate in. And it's winning trust and having the enthusiasm, which really, co-design is a word everybody uses, but genuine co-design and delivery is a really complicated business. And, I'm hoping that we can prove that we're on track to doing that. So you go away, say, but we want this enhancement. It might be a small tweak. It might be an inspirational idea for a new research project, but we'd have to go away and think about that. And that's where, we love receiving emails. You have an idea, we're not going to fob you off, but we might have to say, we just can't fit that in. That's something that you've got to be agitating for us to do because it's too big a project, and we can explain why it's too big a project. It's not just that we're doing hustle. We're trying to solve problems. We want to actually make the world a better place. And so, that's what we will do. We'll try to negotiate and fine tune. And that's where really good co-design helps, refining right through to the publication step, and the feedback we get is really useful.
Thanks. We'll just go to Megan in case it's a link into Dave's comment.
Yeah, it is. I just wanted to take, my name's Megan, I work for the Fire Centre, and I help this team of researchers deliver their research projects from a management sort of level. I just wanted to sort of flag that comment around results available to the public. Absolutely, it's sort of where we're trying to get that, bridge that gap between research and information being available to the public audience, which are increasingly looking at the Fire Centre, either through direct contact or through just media commentary, that they're looking to us to I suppose, have that insight into what the research is actually saying. And one of the challenges for us is, which David was sort of saying as well, is that we're funded to do the research component. For us to actually translate that or drive that into a format that can be delivered to a public audience, whether that's through apps or whether it's through educational content or just how information is then filtered through different stakeholders and agencies, is a really challenging step for us. But ultimately, that's really where we should be getting to, because we can all sit in the room here and from an academic perspective have our publications, which are a currency for science, but it's taking that information, putting it into a format that the everyday person can actually use, and all of a sudden we start to see the true impact of what this research is actually doing. So I just wanted to make a sort of comment to that, available to the public. Absolutely essential, I think, that we look at these research projects and we find ways to take the next step forward. Because it's certainly very necessary.
Thank you, Megan. Now, Rob, you had your hand up for so long. I'll come back to you.
I don't know if I can add to what people have said. I'm interested in one hand on the question of this fairly blunt instrument we use for a lot of things, the fire danger index, and if you look at Los Angeles and the longevity of winds and the damaging nature of the winds even without fire, and the impact of that alone. I'm also interested in how we expand this concept of house loss to loss of lives, livelihoods and environment, for instance, which governments are, where is the line? And it probably goes to one of the comments before. We lose lots of people in our big events. LA didn't lose what you would say is a large number of people in comparison to the houses lost. And is that a nature of the type of spread through the properties or a well-armed community? And ultimately, this total risk that we're trying to reduce here, whether it be through building regs, whether it be through other types of like suppression, etc., on all timescales, it's how we put the downward pressure on enough of this, but also understand to look at the risks that are acceptable risks too. And the comments about data, the last thing I wanted to talk about, the comments about data is absolutely vital. Like if you could overlay on this the suppression capability that was there at the time, the house, the style of house, etc. Those types of things. We've got some work in play at the moment to try and do that. It's going to take us some time, but and a lot of hope. But I think that's going to be the big leap for Australia. We're just too far behind the rest of the country, the rest of the world, in their ability to share data easily. That is a beautiful note to more or less finish on. Thank you, Rob. Data sharing, researchers. In fact, I'd like everyone to thank our researchers for presenting today. They've done a fantastic job. This is like science gone viral for us, really. The idea was just, you know, it was a short PMC and we went, no, it's too good. So within half a week, they turned around and created this excellent hour. So thank you very much. Just want to draw your attention to, there was an article written by NHRA about the LA fires that you can find on the internet. I put a little link into it for you. That we also have a forum where we can continue this excellent discussion in June. But I think if people want to continue the discussion outside or during our PMC meetings, please do be in touch. NHRA will also be running a special webinar about the LA fires on the 27th of February. That will be advertised shortly. So we'd love you to come along to that too. It'll be a different format. So this one today was very much focused on the wonderful research that Dave Bowman and his group are doing. So if you could all get your little react button and give it a clap. Thank you. That's the end of the hour. You're welcome to stay on, but please know they've done a great job. And Andrew's right. And thanks, everybody. It's in the chat. Very keen to understand what the emerging knowledge needs might be, given the context of the work already underway. That's our CEO from NHRA. He's very engaged in making the research useful, usable and used.